Okay, so this morning, what we're going to do, God willing, and hopefully we can get it all done in one class. If not, we'll have to do it in two. And that is to do like an overview of everything we learned in this part 2 of Tanya Shaar haYichud. So 2 quick introductions. Number 1, there are 2 types of summaries. One is where the summary just condenses all the information. Like you give a short synopsis of every item discussed. That's one type of summary. And the other is just to describe the narrative more and the overarching picture of what's being done and what's being achieved. And when you do it that way, sometimes you're missing out certain details, but because you're trying to paint the overall narrative. Now we're going to do the second type, which means I'm not going to review every single thing we learned, but just to kind of give an overview picture of what we're doing. So because I'm doing it the second way, obviously everybody's going to have a different way of doing the summary, because everybody's going to find different details more important for the overall narrative, because in reality, when you think of it deeply, every detail is part of the narrative, but we're not doing that. So I'm sure if another person did the summary, they would highlight other details and other angles that we're not doing here. So that's just kind of like a introduction as to how we're going to do this today. Okay, so we'll break up the introduction into, let's say, 8 stages. And we'll remember them as we go along. So, briefly, number 1 is that which we understand about God's oneness before Tanya, which would be Rambam, number 1. Number 2 is going to be continuous creation, God's continuous creation. Number 3 is creation within the creative force, number 3. Number 4 is the creative force and the concealing force being one and united. Number 5, higher unity. Number 6, lower unity. Number 3, the world of Atzilus, the world where the infinite and the finite meet. And number 8, drawing that down into our reality. That's the flow. So I'm hoping when I just said these words, hopefully a lot of it's coming back, hopefully. So now let's just go through one by one, and we'll see the whole kind of story, the storyline of Shaar haYichud. I guess that's the best way to put this. Not so much a summary, but more the storyline, the narrative of Shaar haYichud. Okay, so let's begin with part 1, which is how the oneness of Hashem is understood before Tanya, primarily using Rambam as our source. So the oneness of Hashem is a mitzvah, right? There's a mitzvah to believe in God, mitzvah number 1, and another mitzvah distinct from that is the mitzvah of God's oneness, God's unity. In our class, we actually looked at the text of Rambam. We read through it itself, the chapter 1 there, of his laws, in which he defines essentially as follows. Most things that exist in this world... Sorry, thank you. Everything that exists in this world as a singular unit exists because it's comprised of a bunch of different things that come together to make that oneness. Everything that exists can be broken down into other elements that come together to make that thing. Whether it's a physical thing, whether it's a metaphysical thing, ideas are broken up of sub-ideas, feelings are broken up of a bunch of different elements, tables certainly made up of a bunch of different elements. So this is what Rambam calls Achdus Morkav, which means a comprised oneness. And when you have a comprised oneness, that's obviously not the beginning, because that comprised oneness is pre-existed by those elements from which it is combined. Those things exist before it. And there's a combining force that brings it all together. So certainly an Achdus Morkav, a comprised oneness, is not where things start. So things start at what he calls an Achdus Pshuta, a simple oneness, or it's not simple. Simple, I guess the right word. Meaning not complex. Simple versus complex. Complex means a bunch of things come together. Versus simple, it just is one. It is one, not because it comes together with anything. It just is unchanging, and that's God's oneness. That's essentially how Rambam describes it. God's oneness is of itself, from itself, without any composites and components. And then from it emerges all creation. From this absolute oneness, the primary being, as Rambam calls it. Okay, so if we stopped here, then God's oneness is detached from our reality. Because our reality is, in fact, the opposite. Our reality is all comprised oneness. The entire world is comprised of a bunch of elements, and we're constantly discovering deeper elements that comprise those elements, and deeper elements that comprise those elements, and so on and so forth. So our world is almost opposite to God's oneness. But this whole reality doesn't change the fact that God's oneness remains God's oneness, but they're detached and distinct from each other if we stopped at this point. Right? And coming at it from this sort of view, then the objective of Shaar haYichud would be, this whole study that we've been doing the last year or so is all to bring God's oneness into our reality, that they're not detached from each other. Yeah? So that would be stage one. What was thought before Tanya, Rambam's definition, God's oneness is absolute, simple, pure, distinct from what we call oneness over here, which is basically coherence of complexities. Yeah? Okay. That's part one. Step two would be the first idea laid out in Tanya, which is this notion of divine continuous creation. The rationale is that essentially everything that exists, which we kind of just finished saying, comes from something else that's before it. And the thing before it contains in it the potential for everything that's going to come out of it. So, simple example, you have a block of silver, and the block of silver can become a cup, a fork, a plate, a mirror, and a trillion other different iterations of what that silver could become in terms of its shape. Now, whatever the silver is going to become, all the conditions for that thing already exist in the silver before. The block of silver already has all the conditions necessary to have a cup, or a spoon, or a plate. They all already exist. Not in reality, in potential. They already exist. Right? The same thing's true of everything. Parents contain in it the potential for their children already. Seeds contain the potential for the trees that will be from it. And so on and so forth. Everything already exists in its pre-manifestation state. It exists in potential in its source. Right? And therefore, when that particular item emerges, it's a standalone existence. It doesn't require any outside force to keep it going, right? Because the silver already contained the potential for the cup. When I come and shape it into a cup, it just stays a cup. Because I didn't really create anything new. I just extracted one particular iteration of the silver. I could have made it into a knife for the same price, right? It's just a question of extracting one particular version from the infinite potential or the trillions of potentials that this silver has. And because of that, the cup doesn't need me once I make it. It's made, it's gone, it's done. Right? However, when it comes to creation, where prior to creation there is nothing, there is no material, there is no concept, there are no conditions prior to creation under which creation makes sense. It's not as if prior to creation all creation existed in potential. If all of existence existed in potential, then that would be the beginning of creation. And what created that potential? You have to go back. You have to go back until finally you come to God himself, who doesn't contain the potential for creation, he just creates. Right? Now, if that's the case, that means all that exists is really coming from nothing. It doesn't have anything before it that says it should be. Right? And therefore, it requires the constant outside force to be propelled into existence, because its state of existence is contrary to what it is, really, which is really nothing. Right? The analogy that the Alter Rebbe gave was the splitting of the sea. But we can use this cup of water for the same price. You have the water. The water inherently is flowing. It's only stopping to flow because there's an outside force called the cup holding it in place. Right? Because whenever you're doing something contrary to its natural state of existence, you have to constantly be there to propel it to stay that way. So the water is standing still, which is contrary to its existence. It's actually trying to flow outward, and it's not, because there's a cup pushing it inward. Right? So everything is like reverting back to its natural state of existence unless it's being propelled outward. And the natural state of existence for all of creation is to not exist, because that's where it started from. So it requires this constant outside force to create. And this is the creative force of God's speech that constantly keeps everything in creation. Or constantly keeps everything in existence. At this point, if we stopped here, okay, so now God's not detached from a reality. It's not as if he created it once and leaves it alone. He's constantly invested in it. Otherwise, the world would revert back to nothingness. But it's true that God's constantly in creation. However, sorry, I had a warning. But nonetheless, we still have two distinct existences. God, the creative force, and the created reality. There's still two distinct existences, one dependent on the other. Right? In other words, God's oneness is here because he's constantly creating, that's fine. God's constantly creating everything, that's great. But we still exist as distinct entities from that force that's creating us. So we haven't merged God in our world yet completely. Yeah, that's stage 2. Stage 3. Good morning. The next principle that the Alter Rebbe lays out is essentially that anything that exists within its source is nothing but source. So, if you take the ray of sun, that's the analogy he uses, the rays of the sun, and you stuff them back into the sun, all you have is the sun. Another way to put it is, the sun itself contains in it the potential for all the rays that will ever emerge from it. But if you slice the sun up, it's not going to be a bunch of rays in there. It's just going to be the sun, right? Because whenever something is in its source, it's nothing but the source itself. This is not an analogy he uses here, but another analogy used elsewhere is a feeling that emerges from an idea. The idea contains in it the feeling that will emerge from it. But when you're looking at the idea, all you have is an idea, even though it contains in it the eventual feeling that will emerge from that idea. The idea being this is good, and the feeling being I want it. Let's just say, right? Okay. So everything that's in its source is nothing but source. Yeah. The tree before it comes out of the seed is just a seed. Yeah. So, if the creative force is constantly creating everything, that means the creative force is not somewhere else, it's in creation. And if it's in creation, and creation and the creative force are in the same place, then really all we have is creative force. Because it's inside of its very source. The creation is in its source being the creative force. Yeah? And therefore, it's not just that creation is dependent on the creative force to keep it going, it's actually within the creative force that's keeping it going. Which means all we really have is creative force. It's all that really exists. Right? Because everything is inside of its source, which is the creative force that creates it. Clear on that? Yeah, that's stage 3. If I'm not clear, stop me. Yeah, we're clear?
Can you just continue with that? Just
right.
say it again.
So, because the creative force, it's not as if, okay, so when I make that cup, right, I hear the cup there, it's distinct from me, it leaves me, it's gone. But because we just finished saying that God is continuously creating, which means the force that brings this thing into being is not somewhere else, it's here. It's in the very space of the thing that's created. Right? So which means the created thing is inside of its source, the creative force. So really all there is the creative force. We just don't see it, but all there really is just the creative force, God himself. God's creative force is the only thing that really is.
How is that different from God propelling something into existence? Is it because it can be left alone and the one is not, it's in it?
Yes, they follow one from each other. But we're dividing them into two because they're rationally built on each other. Right? Stage 1 is everything's dependent on the creative force. Okay. Stage 2 is, well, if everything's dependent on the creative force continuously, then it's really always in its source the whole time. If that's the case, all we have is creative force. Even though we don't see it, but all there really is the creative force. There's nothing really else there. Right? So now already no longer do we have distinct entities, creation and creative force. There is only one reality, creative force. But if we stopped here, we're still stuck with a problem, which is that it has nothing to do with me and you. It's a truth from God's perspective. It has nothing to do with me and you. Our perspective is that we exist. So it's true that God's oneness is the only reality and the created existence is just all within it. But it's only true from his perspective, not true from our perspective. Our perspective is still distinct from God himself. Okay, that's stage 3. Now we go to stage 4. The truth is that the fact that we don't see God is just as much God as the fact that he creates. They're both equally him. It's not as if the creative force is him, and then the fact that we don't see is our issue. The fact that we don't see is also his doing. Right? So the presence of God is not only in the fact that everything exists, but also in the fact that which exists doesn't see that he's making them exist. So now the oneness of Hashem is not just present in spite of our perspective, but actually our perspective is the result of his oneness and his presence. God's presence is now becoming more integrated into our reality. Okay? Clear so far as stage 4. Yeah? Right, stage 1 is God's oneness is not comprised, it's simple. Stage 2 is God's creating everything every single moment. Stage 3 is everything is in the creative force, so therefore all that's really there is the creative force. All that's really there is the creative force. And stage 4 is the fact that we don't see the creative force is also the creator. Clear? Yeah? Okay. Stage 5. Understanding this notion in its purest form, to understand this idea that the fact that God's creating and the fact that we don't see him is equally him, understanding this in its purest form is what the author termed the higher unity. Right? And the higher unity is understood climbing upwards in this kind of fashion. We see, as a matter of reality, or we understand, that the creative force and the force that conceals the creative force work in tandem. They're not competing forces. It's not as if the concealing force is trying to push God away, and the creative force is trying to present God. They work in tandem to create our reality. If either one were dominant, then creation wouldn't exist. Because if all you had was the creative force, we wouldn't exist. We would be like the ray of sun inside the sun, just all sun. We would be like, there would be only God perspective, there wouldn't be creation. If the only thing that exists was the concealment of God, again, there wouldn't be any creation, because where's the creative force? So they actually work in tandem. They work together, right? Like we explained when we learned this, that all revelation is simultaneously a concealment. Right? If I'm sharing with you ideas, I'm only sharing them with you because I'm concealing them in the words that are being delivered to you. I have to take my ideas, stuff them into little words, and then present them to you. I could not reveal to you in any other way. If I just gave you words, you wouldn't have any idea. And if I just gave you idea, you'd have no way to scramble them. You'd have no way to extract what they actually mean. Right? So I have to conceal whatever it is I'm thinking or feeling, present them in words, and then deliver the words to you. So the words that are delivered to you are both revealing and concealing simultaneously. And that's the only way to express, is by both revealing and concealing at the same time. So we see, as a matter of fact, God creating and God concealing himself is really one singular force of creation, to both conceal and reveal, both conceal and create. Right? Now, if that's the case, they're working like that together, it's because in their source, they're really one. They're really one in their source, which is Hashem himself. He wants to create. Okay, so if he wants to create, almost spontaneously and simultaneously, there's a creative force and a concealing force. Because inherently they're really one in their source. Right? Now there's the key again. The creative force and the concealing force are one in their source. We already had the earlier principle. If everything's one in its source, what do you have? Just source. Which means the creative force and the concealing force of God are all just in God himself. So really what we're looking at is, the only truth is God himself, his creative force, his concealing force, and the net result creation, all just inside of him. That's the higher unity. There's just God. That's it. There's just God, and everything else just exists inside of him. The closest analogy which we used was someone imagining something. If I imagine something in my mind, so I can have an argument going on in my head between two people that exist in this complex palace somewhere, and there's a bunch of different details and whatever, but all those things, even the people who are arguing, are all just me. It's not as if the guy who has an opinion against my opinion is somehow not me. It's all just me. It all exists just in me. Right? That's the higher unity, where everything just exists within Hashem. Because nothing leaves the space of his reality. And if everything's in its original source, both the creative force and the concealing force and the net result creation all exist within him, and that's all there is, just him. Higher unity. So again, if we stay here, if we stop that higher unity, we'd still be stuck with this idea that God's oneness is in spite of our reality. In spite of our perspective, it's all just him. But if we asked our perspective, is God here? The answer would still be no. In spite of our perspective, God's there. But that's not our perspective, though. Following? So we're still not there yet. It's not like Rambam, in which God's oneness is here and creation is here. Creation is in God's oneness, but not that creation itself presents God's oneness. It's just that we don't really care about creation because it's inside him, and his oneness remains one, even though there's a creation inside of him. That's all just in him. But our perspective doesn't yet contain that oneness yet. It's that our perspective exists in his oneness, but it doesn't contain his oneness. If we stopped here at the higher unity. Right? Okay, from there we go. That was stage 5. From there we go to stage 6, which would be the lower unity. The lower unity says like this: if everything is in God, which is the higher unity, then it follows that God himself is in everything. Now, if God is in everything, that means he's certainly in the creative force. He's inside the concealing force. He's also in the force that says there should be independent view. So wherever that creative force goes to create independent view, it's not just that all that's in him, but he's also in it. So if you're using the analogy of my imagination, it's not just that those two people arguing exist inside of me. It's also that I am within their arguments. It's not as if they have their own arguments, and then those arguments exist in my head. No. I exist inside those arguments too. That's the lower unity. Which means even the perspective of the person arguing is really just me. Not just in spite of his perspective, it exists inside me. I'm in that perspective too. You following this? This is the lower unity. I just remember this when we spoke about it. it's easier rationally to square away the higher unity because it's simpler, it's neater. God's the only reality, everything's inside of him. But on an emotional level, the lower unity is much more appealing. Because on an emotional level, I'm here. So you tell me everything's in God, great, but I still wake up in the morning and I say, I'm hungry. And the first sentence I have is I, so I'm still here. What do I do with that? So says the lower unity, well, actually, in your sense of you, God's in there too. Not just in spite of you thinking you exist, not just in spite of your perspective that you are there, you're in God. No. In your perspective too, you're God. There's God. God is in the perspective of our independence, not just despite of our dependence, we exist in him. Following? That's lower unity. Higher unity, everything's in God. Lower unity, God's in everything. Inside these perspectives. Right? So at this point, we really actually reached the end of harmonizing God's oneness in our reality. That God's oneness is not just in spite of our reality, not just our realities in it, but actually his oneness is within our reality and within our perspective and within the struggles and things that we're dealing with. Right? Now to understand that, we have the last two stages, 7 and 8. So, are we clear so far? Yeah, so one is Rambam, God's one, absolute oneness, everything else is comprised oneness. Stage 2, God's continuously creating everything, so it can't be detached. Stage 3, if God's creating everything every single second, everything exists in the creative force, all we have is creative force. Stage 4, the fact that you don't see creative force, that's also God. Stage 5, well, if everything is God, everything exists within him, his creative force, his concealing force, our reality all exists within him, higher unity, all that exists is God. Stage 6, God is inside everything. So even from our perspective, it's truly him.
I feel like I need more explanation.
Sorry?
I thought
on which point? The last on stage 6?
Yeah, like
okay,
it doesn't make me feel like I feel God.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't make you feel like you feel God, but it tells you that the feeling you have that I am here is not a feeling that's detached from Hashem. Hashem is in that feeling too. Right? You're still going to be stuck with I exist. But in other words, like this: the higher unity, which is everything is within God. If I wanted to connect with God, I'd have to stop being me. Because if I'm me, I'm detached. Because it's all within him. So if I say I'm here, I'm like lying about the truth that God's the only reality. But if we're going with the lower unity, that Hashem is in everything, then I don't have to stop being me. I have to be me. And in my me, be aware of his presence. Not transcend being me. Almost a practical application is, does a person have to let go of his personality and just follow what Hashem says? Because if you have your personality, then it's you, it's independent from Hashem. Or use your personality to reveal Hashem. Only the lower unity says use your personality to reveal Hashem, because Hashem is in all those things, not just in spite of all those things. But the higher unity would say, forget your thinking, just Hashem, that's all, because that's the only reality. Your thinking, that's separation, says the higher unity.
I see.
Whereas lower unity says, no, you have your particular version of living, okay, God's in there too, find it. That's lower unity. Which is why, again, even though rationally the higher unity sounds better, it's neater, but on an emotional, experiential level, the lower unity is much more appealing, is much more true to our reality, because I exist and I have my distinct personality. You like my notes? Yeah. Okay, so to understand this last thing, the lower unity, we have stage 7 and 8. Stage 7 is the world of Atzilus, that's what they called it, which is where the infinite and the finite meet. And stage 8 is how that permeates within our reality. So let's go one by one. The world of Atzilus, this world where the infinite and the finite meet, because there's like, it's very difficult to understand this, because you're talking about everything's within God, okay, so it's just transcendent truth of God. And then God's in everything, which means God himself has to, or does, manifest in defined things. So how do the two meet? How does God go from being transcendent into being finite and defined? Which is a never-ending discovery to exactly try to articulate what this even means, that the infinite and the finite interact. But that's the world of Atzilus, as we call it. So, for there, we have the language of the Kabbalah, which is the language of the light and the vessels. And the point of the light and the vessels, two different components, we're trying to kind of combine them. Number one is, when light shines at a bunch of different color glasses, and they present themselves on the other side of different glasses, it does not diminish the fact that the light is really a singular light. It just so happens to be that as it shines through, here it presents red because it's going through red glass, there goes blue, there goes green, right? When the sun shines, it doesn't make a difference if I have a window here or not. But if I have a window here or not will determine whether I have light. But as far as the sun goes, it doesn't make a difference. The sun's shining, right? So the light the infinite transcendence of Hashem remains transcendent, even though it happens to animate particular definitions. Wisdom, kindness, understanding, knowledge, and all the rest of those definitions. The 10 definitions that we have, 10 sefirot. But the oneness of Hashem that projects through it remains singularly one. Another analogy we used is electricity running through a toaster, my phone, light bulb, or, I don't know, the electrical grid. It's not distinct, separate electricity. It's one electricity. Just different vessels that use the electricity power to power different things. But the electricity remains one. Right? That's the power of Hashem remains one, even though it's animating distinction, which are these vessels. Right? Number one. Number two, we have, back to Rambam, ironically, where Rambam tells us that God is one with his wisdom and his knowledge, all from one perspective. Most people, or everybody, were comprised of me, my mind, and then the information I learn. For Hashem, Rambam told us, he, the knowledge, the known, the knower, all one. All of it's one. Which means, Rambam is telling us, it's not just the light that remains one, but it's the vessel too that's one with the light. The vessel, being the definition of wisdom, is one with the light, the knower of that definition. Follow that? And says the Alter Rebbe, the same thing is true of every one of the definitions of Hashem. It's not like I have strength, and I can acquire more strength. I can lose my strength. Because it's me, my strength, and the thing I'm imposing my strength on, I don't know, let's say, until something beats me down, and now I lost it. Right? Whereas for Hashem, it's not he, his strength, and the thing he's imposing his strength on. It's all one in him. He himself contains in himself the strength, and the thing is going to be strong on. So it's not just that the light remains one, and the vessels give distinction, but the vessels themselves are one with the light themselves. This is an impossibility to understand. It's an inherent impossibility, because we only understand distinction. We don't understand distinction that's simultaneously one, but it doesn't change the fact that that's the way it is. And that's the world of Atzilus, which is a very difficult world to understand, probably the most difficult. Right? It's easier to understand transcendence or plain definition. But to talk about how transcendence becomes one with definition, that's of course much more difficult. That's the meeting point. Yeah? Now stage 7. Now stage 8 says, the final of these definitions, the last of these definitions, is Hashem's ability to create otherness, malchus, speech, which projects outward. Which means Hashem's ability to create otherness is also one with him, just as his intelligence is one with him, his strength is one with him, his kindness, all that's one with him, so is his ability to create otherness, his speech. So what does the speech do? All the speech does is, it takes that oneness and draws it into distinct definition. Here it's a cup of water, here it's the light of the sun, here it's a table, here it's an angel, here it's a human. But it's only taking the oneness of Hashem, which is one with that force of division, and bringing that oneness into all division. And that every single distinct thing that exists in this world, as distinct as it is from everything else, is really just an expression of the truth that it's Hashem's oneness contained in it. Considering that this force to create otherness, this force of speech that allows for division, is itself in absolute oneness with Hashem himself, just like his intelligences and his kindness and his wisdom and so on and so forth. And that creative force, that speech that gives definition and brings the oneness of Hashem into creation, that is the creative force that we talked about way back when, that keeps everything in existence always. Bringing the whole Shaar in a full loop. Okay. So that's a kind of broad strokes overview narrative of Shaar HaYichud. Hope that was somewhat helpful, at least to give us like a map. Maybe someone will ask AI to write this out for us in summary. And in terms of like practical application, there's a few different ways you can come to this. And really, this takes us to the introduction that the Alter Rebbe himself wrote to part 2, which is the objective is that the Jew develop a relationship with Hashem. In order to develop a relationship, one has to understand Hashem. So in these 12 chapters, he's giving us that understanding, giving us that language. Now, this understanding and language can be applied to various different emotions. I can think about how incredibly awesome it is that God's absolutely one and invested in everything and stand in awe, reverence. I can think about how incredibly amazing it is and think about, I wish I knew more, I wish I felt this more, I wish I felt Hashem's presence in me more. That's a kind of love, attraction. I'm attracted to this, I want to see more. Another way to think about it is, with all this grandeur and greatness of Hashem's oneness, he says he doesn't care about all of it, all he wants is me in my life. That's incredibly empowering. But it's all the same ideas, depending on how once I have the language to understand how it is God interacts with our world, then that language can be applied to various different meditations that will yield various different emotional responses, which is really what part 1 of Tanya is all about. Part 1 of Tanya helps us use these ideas and to navigate our inner feelings and how to develop those feelings in our connection with Hashem. So God willing, it is the president of the class, so you'll decide what we're going to do next week. But this brings us to the conclusion of our journey through Shaar, HaYichud, which is, how long did we do this? For a year?
No. I think beginning of the year.
5-6 months? It's a long time. We really thought about a lot of these things and hope this was helpful. Hope the ideas are coming back as we talked about them. And Hashem's help, let us know. But next week we're out of town.
Right.
So, after Purim, really. We're going to continue then after Purim. So you'll let us know what our next...
Yeah. I'm curious
our next challenge is.
What